I want to tell you about the day my uncle laughed in my face. Not a private laugh. Not the kind people try to hide. The open, confident laugh of someone who believes completely that they have won and that the person they are laughing at has no recourse and no power and no path forward that leads anywhere except away from the thing they are laughing about. He laughed in the lobby of a bank in Savannah, Georgia. He laughed because I had just found out that the account my father had set up for me, the account that contained the accumulated pension and disability payments of a United States Army Master Sergeant who had served 22 years and been injured in the line of duty and who had died leaving his daughter as the sole designated beneficiary, that account had been drained. $642,000. Gone. Moved over the course of 14 months into accounts in my uncle's name through a series of transactions that had been executed using a power of attorney that my father had granted my uncle 3 years before his death when the injury had limited his capacity to manage his own affairs and he had needed someone he trusted to help him. He had trusted his brother. His brother had stolen from him. And when I stood in that bank lobby and understood what had happened and turned to look at my uncle who had come, I understand now, specifically to be present for the moment I found out, he laughed. He said, "What are you going to do about it, sweetheart? You have been gone for 6 years. You do not even know what happened here." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, very quietly, "I am going to find out." He laughed again. He walked out of the bank. What I found out over the following 8 months. What I brought into a courtroom in Savannah 14 months after that lobby. And what happened when I walked through those courtroom doors in my dress uniform, is the story I am going to tell you today. But I cannot start there. I have to start at the beginning. If you are new here, please subscribe right now and drop your country and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you all the way back. My name is Captain Sarah Reeves. United States Army Military Police Corps. I am 34 years old. I investigate crimes. For 9 years I have been investigating crimes in the most demanding investigative environment that exists, the military criminal investigation apparatus of the United States Army, which operates under standards of evidence and procedure that most civilian investigators encounter only in textbooks. I know how financial crimes work. I know how fraudulent transactions are constructed and how they are documented and how they are traced and how the people who commit them believe they have covered their tracks and how they have almost always not covered their tracks as well as they believe. My uncle believed he had covered his tracks. He had not covered his tracks. But I am getting ahead of myself. My father's name was Master Sergeant Raymond Reeves, United States Army, retired. He served 22 years. He deployed 4 times, twice to the Gulf, once to Iraq, once to Afghanistan. He was a man of the specific, disciplined, quietly competent quality that 22 years of military service produces in the people who are built for it. He did not talk about his service often. He did not need to. It was visible in everything about him, the posture, the precision, the specific way he organized his life and his responsibilities and his love for his daughter. He was injured in Afghanistan. Not catastrophically, not in the way that ends careers and takes limbs. But seriously enough. A traumatic brain injury sustained in an IED incident that affected his cognitive function in ways that were not immediately obvious but that accumulated over time into something that significantly impaired his ability to manage complex tasks. He came home. He retired. He received his pension and his disability payments and he settled in Savannah with the specific, quiet intention of a man who had given his body to his country and was now going to spend whatever time he had in the city where he had grown up. I was in the Army by then. I had commissioned at 22, following my father, as daughters of soldiers sometimes do, and I was building a career in military law enforcement that was, by the time my father's injury became serious, taking me to duty stations that were not Savannah. My father needed help managing his affairs. He called his brother. His brother's name is Thomas Reeves. He is 58 years old. He is not a veteran. He is a man who has spent his adult life in the specific, fruitless proximity to other people's success, close enough to observe it, never close enough to build it himself. He had borrowed money from my father multiple times over the years. He had been helped by my father multiple times over the years. He had received, from my father, the specific, sustained generosity of a man who believed family meant something. He had also, I would learn, spent years watching my father's pension and disability payments accumulate and calculating what he could do with them if he ever had access. The injury gave him access. My father, in the vulnerability of someone whose cognitive function was declining and who needed someone to help him navigate the administrative complexity of managing a veteran's benefits, granted Thomas a power of attorney. He trusted his brother. His brother spent 14 months methodically stealing everything. My father died 18 months after the power of attorney was granted. He died from a stroke, secondary complications from the TBI, his doctor told me. He died in the house in Savannah where he had grown up and where he had returned to live after retirement. I flew home on emergency leave. I buried my father. I stood at his grave in the Savannah National Cemetery with the folded flag in my hands that the honor guard had given me, and I felt the specific, total grief of someone who has lost the person who understood her most completely. Then I flew back to my duty station because I was a soldier and duty does not pause for grief. I processed what needed to be processed from a distance. My father's attorney contacted me. The estate was small, my father had not been wealthy, the pension and disability payments had been his primary financial asset, and those were in the account he had designated for me. The attorney explained the account. The designation. The process for transferring the funds. And then the attorney said something that stopped me. He said, "Captain Reeves, I need to tell you something about the account balance." I said, "What about it?" He said, "The balance is significantly lower than it should be. Based on the pension and disability payment history I have reviewed, the account should contain approximately $642,000. And? I said. The current balance, he said, is $4,311. I sat very still. Where's the rest of it? I said. He told me what he had found. The power of attorney. The 14 months of transactions. The accounts in my uncle's name. I requested emergency leave. I flew to Savannah. I went to the bank. And Thomas was there. Waiting. I want to tell you about the 8 months between the bank lobby and the courtroom. Not because the investigation is the most important part of this story, the people and the loss are the most important part. But because the investigation is what built the case and the case is what brought us to the courtroom and the courtroom is where everything resolved. I am a military police investigator. I have spent 9 years investigating financial crimes, fraud, theft, and the specific complex intersection of criminal behavior and financial documentation that most people find impenetrable. I found it penetrable. The transactions Thomas had executed were sophisticated enough to fool someone who did not know what they were looking at. He had used the power of attorney carefully, not in large, obvious transfers, but in a pattern of smaller movements that individually looked like legitimate expense management and that collectively amounted to systematic theft. He had hired an accountant to help structure it. He had opened multiple accounts. He had created paper trails that were designed to support a narrative of legitimate financial management, expenses for my father's care, property maintenance, medical equipment, the specific categories of legitimate expenditure that a power of attorney holder might reasonably incur. He had done this carefully. He had not done it carefully enough. Because the expenses he had documented did not match the services that had actually been rendered. The invoices he had created referred to providers who, when I contacted them, had no record of the transactions. The medical equipment purchases referenced items that had never been delivered. The property maintenance records referred to work that neighbors confirmed had never been done. The paper trail he had built was a fiction. Underneath the fiction was the real trail, the actual destination of the money, the accounts in Thomas's name, the specific, documented movement of funds from my father's account to his brother's control. I documented everything. Every transaction. Every fictitious invoice. Every provider who had no record. Every piece of the fiction and the real thing underneath it. I worked for 8 months. Then I called a civilian attorney in Savannah named Marcus Webb who had been recommended to me by 3 separate people in the legal community. There is someone who was both brilliant and willing to take cases that required sustained effort. I drove to his office. I put 1,200 pages of documentation on his desk. He looked at the stack. He looked at me. He said, "Captain Reeves, where did you learn to build a case like this?" I said, "The Army." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to take this case." I said, "I know. That is why I am here." The case went to trial 14 months after the bank lobby. I want to tell you about the morning of the trial. I had been in Savannah for a week. I had spent the week in meetings with Marcus and his team, reviewing the documentation, preparing the testimony, and making a specific decision about how I was going to appear in court. Not as a civilian. As a soldier. I made this decision carefully and deliberately. Not for theater. For precision. Thomas Reeves had built his defense on a specific narrative. The narrative was that he had been a dedicated caregiver to his brother. That the financial management he had exercised under the power of attorney had been legitimate. That I, as a daughter who had been absent for 6 years while he had been present and caring, had no standing to challenge what he had done. The narrative required me to be something specific. The estranged daughter. The absent one. The soldier who had chosen the army over her family and who was now trying to claim something she had not been present to maintain. I wanted the jury to see who I actually was from the moment I walked through the door. Not estranged. Present. Not absent. In uniform. In the dress uniform of a United States Army captain, military police corps, 9 years of service, the specific and visible evidence of exactly where I had been while Thomas Reeves was stealing from my father. I had been serving. I had been doing what my father had done. I had been honoring the same commitment that my father had honored for 22 years and that Thomas Reeves had spent 14 months stealing the accumulated reward of. I put on my dress uniform the morning of the trial. I drove to the courthouse. I walked through the doors. Thomas was already in the courtroom when I entered. He was sitting at the defendant's table with his attorney, a man named Paul Garrett who was known in Savannah for his ability to construct sympathetic narratives around unsympathetic facts. He was talking to Garrett in the low, urgent way of someone who needs reassurance about what is about to happen. He looked up when I walked in. He saw the uniform. I watched his face. The specific thing that happened to his face when he saw me walk through those doors in my dress uniform is something I have thought about many times since. Not guilt. Not shame, not yet. Something more immediate than either. The specific, sudden recognition that the person he had been dismissing for 8 months was not who he had thought she was. He had been preparing his defense against the estranged daughter. He had not prepared it against a military police investigator who had spent 8 months building a 1,200-page evidentiary record. Those are not the same person. His face understood this approximately 1 second after he saw the uniform. The jury entered. The judge entered. The Honorable Catherine Morris, Chatham County Superior Court, 15 years on the bench. She looked at me when she sat down. She looked at the uniform. Then she looked at Thomas. Then she called the session to order. Marcus opened. He was precise and methodical and he walked the jury through the structure of what had happened, the power of attorney, the 14 months, the $642,000, the paper trail that was a fiction and the real trail underneath it. He did not embellish. He did not need to. The documentation embellished itself. Garrett opened for the defense. His narrative was exactly what I had anticipated. The dedicated brother. The absent daughter. The legitimate expenses of caring for a man with a traumatic brain injury. The complexity of managing finances for someone who could no longer fully manage them himself. He was skilled. The narrative was sympathetic. And the documentation destroyed it. Exhibit by exhibit. Provider by provider. Invoice by invoice. The 1,200 pages of documentation that I had spent 8 months building went before the jury as a methodical, irrefutable demonstration that the fiction Thomas had constructed was exactly that. Fiction. The medical equipment company that had no record of the purchases. The property maintenance firm that confirmed they had done no work at my father's address during the relevant period. The caregiver agency whose invoices had been paid but who had provided no services because they had no contract with Thomas or my father. Each one. Every one. The fiction collapsed exhibit by exhibit. Thomas testified. I want to tell you about his testimony because it was the moment the jury understood something that the documentation could not fully convey. Paul Garrett walked him through his narrative. The care. The dedication. The complexity of managing a TBI patient's affairs. The legitimate expenses. The specific, humanizing version of events that Garrett had constructed. Thomas delivered it. Not badly. He was a man who had spent his life in proximity to other people's success, and he had learned, over the years, how to present himself in ways that served his interests. He was smooth. He was practiced. Then Marcus cross-examined him. Marcus was a different kind of attorney in cross-examination than he was in direct. In direct he was methodical and thorough. In cross he was precise and relentless and operated with the specific, controlled patience of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is not going to be deflected from getting there. He asked Thomas about each exhibit. Specifically. Mr. Reeves. Exhibit 47. The invoice from Coastal Medical Supply for $12,000. Dated March 14. Can you explain why Coastal Medical Supply has no record of this transaction? Thomas said there must be a record-keeping error. Mr. Reeves. Exhibit 63. The invoice from Savannah Property Services for $8,000. Dated April 2. Can you explain why Savannah Property Services confirms they performed no work at your brother's address during this period? Thomas said there was a miscommunication. Mr. Reeves. Exhibit 91. The wire transfer of $23,000 from your brother's account to your personal account on May 17. The documentation you have submitted characterizes this as reimbursement for caregiving expenses. Can you identify the specific caregiving expenses this payment reimburses? Thomas could not. Not specifically. Not in the way the documentation required. Because the expenses did not exist and the documentation he had created to support them had not been created with the specific rigor of someone who expected the underlying transactions to be traced by a military investigator with 9 years of experience. He had not prepared for me. He had prepared for the estranged daughter. The estranged daughter was not there. The verdict came on the 4th day. Guilty. On all counts. Financial exploitation of a disabled adult. Theft by conversion. Fraud. The specific, enumerated charges that Marcus and I had built the case around and that the jury had spent 2 days considering. Guilty on all. Thomas Reeves looked at the jury when the verdict was read with the expression of someone who has believed, until the exact moment of disconfirmation, that a specific outcome was impossible. He had believed he had won. He had believed that the estranged daughter in Savannah for the first time in 6 years, standing in a bank lobby understanding what had happened, had no path forward. He had been wrong. I sat at the plaintiff's table and I did not allow my face to do anything that was not appropriate for a courtroom. But I thought about my father. About Master Sergeant Raymond Reeves, 22 years of service, 4 deployments, a TBI sustained in the service of this country, $642,000 of accumulated pension and disability payments that represented those 22 years of service. I thought about the folded flag. About the honor guard at the Savannah National Cemetery. About the specific, total grief of someone who has lost the person who understood her most completely. I thought about what my father would have said. He would not have been surprised. He had taught me to build cases. Not in the specific sense, he was not an investigator. but in the general sense of someone who approaches problems methodically and documents carefully and does not leave things undone that need to be done. He had taught me that. Without knowing, he was teaching me. And when someone stole what he had spent 22 years building, I had done the only thing he would have expected me to do. I built a case. I brought it to court. I walked through the door in the uniform that said exactly where I had been and what I had been doing and what kind of person Thomas Reeves had made the specific mistake of laughing at in a bank lobby. The smirk was long gone. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. Thomas received 7 years. The restitution order included the full $642,000 plus interest and legal fees, an amount that the court recognized he could not pay immediately and that will be the subject of enforcement proceedings for years. He will not pay all of it. I understand this. Financial restitution in cases of this kind is rarely fully recovered. The money my father accumulated over 22 years of service is not coming back in the form it left. But the record is clear. The verdict is in the record. The documentation is in the record. And Thomas Reeves's conviction for financial exploitation of a disabled veteran is in the record. My father's service is in the record. What was taken from him is acknowledged in the record. That is not everything. But it is something real. And real things matter even when they are insufficient. After the sentencing, I went to the Savannah National Cemetery. I went to my father's grave. I stood there for a long time in my dress uniform. I did not say anything. I am not someone who speaks to graves in the way that movies suggest people speak to graves. I stood there in the specific, silent presence of someone who has done the thing that needed to be done and is taking a moment to acknowledge that it is done. Then I said one thing. I said, "I got it, Dad." And then I stood at attention. And I saluted. The way soldiers salute the people they serve. The way daughters salute the fathers who taught them what service means. I am still in the army. I am still investigating crimes. The work I do, the specific, methodical, documentation-intensive work of tracing financial crimes and building evidentiary records and bringing cases that seem unwinnable to courts where they win, that work is what I was built for. My father built it in me. Not by teaching me investigative techniques. By modeling the specific qualities that made me good at them. The patience. The methodical attention to detail. The refusal to be discouraged by complexity. The understanding that the truth is in the documentation if you look carefully enough and long enough. He built those things in me. Thomas tried to take what my father built. He took the money. He could not take what my father had actually left me. Before you go, I want to say something directly to anyone who is in the middle of something like this. To anyone whose family has taken something from someone they loved who was no longer able to protect it. To anyone who has been laughed at in a lobby. To anyone who has been told, "What are you going to do about it?" I want to tell you what you do about it. You document. You find the people who know how to build the case. You walk through the door and whatever you have that says exactly who you are and what you are capable of. And you let the documentation speak. The truth is in the documentation. It always is. Find it. Drop the word salute in the comments if this story reached something real in you. Salute for my father. Salute for every veteran whose service deserves to be protected. Salute for everyone who has stood at a grave and said, "I got it." And if you are new here, subscribe. Every single day I share a new story about family, about service, about justice, and about the people who built the case when the case needed to be built. I will see you in the next one. Kayla's Dark Truth.